Okay, so technically biochemistry, water is part of biochemistry. This particular chapter is specifically about organic biochemistry. We're going to be talking about compounds and living things that contain carbon, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids. But technically water is also part of biochemistry because water is like 70% of our body. So it's a big part of biochemistry. The test on this next week, by the way, Thursday, there won't be specific questions about the basic chemistry lecture that you're supposed to go fill in. That's review stuff. The questions will be about the water lecture and about biochemistry. The only thing is, remember that it's expected when I say, oh, water has polar covalent bonds, you know what that means, which means you may need to go back and refer to the basic chemistry information. Make sure you know what electronegativity is, things like that. Whatever applies to what we're talking about, you're responsible for. So, biochemistry is basically going to be organic compounds in this particular section. And organic basically just means it contains carbon. In the case of all the compounds we're going to talk about, they actually all contain both carbon and hydrogen both. And the word organic literally translates from life, because originally they thought that these were compounds that were only found in living things. We now know that's not the case. In fact, when you study organic chemistry, you really don't necessarily talk about living things at all. You learn about different groups that form all kinds of compounds like acetone and formaldehyde and alcohols and ketones and waxes and plastics and stuff like that. But our focus is going to be on specific organic compounds that are important to living things. So the backbone of an organic compound is basically called a hydrocarbon. And just like it sounds like, a hydrocarbon is nothing more than just hydrogen and carbon. In fact, the simplest organic compound, if we were to look at just the base for all of this, would be methane, which you don't have to memorize, by the way. You don't have to know that methane is the simplest. But methane is nothing more than a carbon surrounded by hydrogens. And based on this, how many bonds can a carbon make? 4. Carbon's sort of right in the middle. If you remember that some atoms want to gain electrons and some want to lose electrons to get 8, well, carbon has exactly 4. It's not going to be very easy to get rid of 4 or to gain 4 to make 8. So carbon is going to be an excellent example of something that's always going to share electrons. It's going to form covalent compounds and share with other things because it's very difficult to steal 4, and it's also very difficult for something to get rid of 4. These are just some other examples of hydrocarbons. Again, you do not have to know any of these examples. Ethane, propane, butane. Propane's like what is in your propane tank when you grill. Butane's in butane lighters. Not that you smoke, but butane lighters. And these are nothing more than long carbon chains. What this really looks like would be, butane would just look like this. It would just be a long chain of hydrogen and carbon. Every carbon would have 4 things attached to it, and in this case it's all just hydrogens. So you don't have to know these particular compounds, just understand that that's what a hydrocarbon is. It's just a long chain of carbons. Now for the purposes of what we're going to be talking about, for living things, biochemistry, the most important thing that's going to happen here is that these chains of carbon are going to have special connections to them called functional groups. And depending on the functional groups, that's what's going to determine the job of that particular hydrocarbon. So for example, certain functional groups are going to make it a lipid, and it's going to behave as an oil, or a fat, or a wax, or a steroid. Other functional groups are going to make it a carbohydrate, so it's going to behave as a sugar, or a starch, a polysaccharide, a monosaccharide. Other functional groups make it a protein.
So you're saying that functional groups attach to the carbon only?
Correct. I'm going to show you, in fact, on the next slide is actually all the functional groups that you need to know. My suggestion to you, because I will post this lecture on Edline eventually, but my suggestion to you would be to just take a snapshot of these after I put them all up. It's just a single slide, but when they're all up, take a snapshot and maybe try making some flashcards. People complain that biochem is the hardest chapter. You may have heard that from people from last year. You say biochem and you'll see by their faces that they did not like this chapter. And the main reason why is because this chapter requires a lot of memorization of how these organic compounds look. And so the functional groups, which I'm going to show you on this slide, I would just recommend after they're all up, take a snapshot and start learning them. Don't wait until the last minute and then try to learn 10 functional groups, because it's going to be hard to do if you wait until the last minute. Every single one of these we're going to be talking about in detail starting tomorrow when we get into proteins and lipids, and you'll see, well, why is a hydroxyl important? Where is an alcohol going to be? Well, when we talk about triglycerides, fats, you're going to see something called a glycerol, which includes an alcohol group. So this is an easy one, hydroxyl. If you remember learning polyatomics in chemistry, you probably remember hydroxyl, the OH. Phosphate's another one that you may have learned in chemistry as PO4 with a -3 charge, the polyatomic. I don't know if you remember what I'm talking about when I say polyatomic. You had to crisscross to get the formulas, ammonium nitrate and, nitrogen, or well, that would be one. Anyway, so that's phosphate. Phosphate's important in ATP, for example. In fact, it's the most important part of ATP. What does ATP stand for? Do you remember? Adenosine triphosphate. 3 phosphates, and the phosphates are the most important part of ATP. So that's why you need to recognize what a phosphate is. This is called an amine or an amino group. This R is not an element. R just represents whatever it's attached to, sort of like how you use X in algebra as a variable. So in other words, the actual amine or amino group is this, the NHH. And then it would be connected to something. But this would be called the amino group. I'm pretty sure you've heard of an amino acid. Amino acids, you hear them talk about it on TV. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Why are they called amino acids? Because every one of them has an amino group on it. That's where the name amino acid comes from. So that's why we're learning about the amino group. The next one is called an ester. When we talk about DNA and RNA, you're going to see esters. Again, the R just represents that it could be anything in that spot. The ester group itself is the carbon double bonded to oxygen and then bonded to another oxygen here. The most important place you're going to see this is when we see the ladder of the double helix of DNA. The different nucleotides are connected by what are called phosphodiester bonds. And obviously an ester is this. What do you think the phospho refers to? It's already up here. Phosphate. It's going to be a phosphate connected to one of these. Aldehyde and ketone, this is actually in the pre-lab. When you work on the pre-lab today, you'll see this. They're going to show you a diagram, and they're going to ask you to circle the aldehyde in the diagram. Aldehyde and ketone are actually both almost the same thing. It's a carbon double bonded to oxygen, right here. The thing is, if the carbon double bonded to oxygen is in the middle of something, and then you've got these chains on the two sides, it's a ketone. If the carbon double bonded to oxygen is on the end, so it's going to be a carbon double bonded to oxygen and then a little hydrogen right here. Now it's called an aldehyde. So it's really the carbon double bonded to oxygen that's important. If it's in the middle, it's a ketone. If it's on the end, it's an aldehyde. Yes?
So we need to know how each of these look?
Basically, you're going to need to know how they look. What I would probably not do is give you 5 of these and say which of these is an aldehyde. But if I drew for you, for example, this is the drawing of an amino acid. So let's say I gave you a drawing of this, and I said which part of this would be an amino group. I would expect that you would know, oh, okay, that's the amino group that makes it an amino acid, because you know what an amino is. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So there's going to be an application of it, but not necessarily a question where I'm just going to say which of these is pointing to a phosphate. Although phosphate's a really easy one, I would think you would know that one. This is called a thiol or a sulfhydryl group. This is actually going to be really important when we talk about how proteins fold up. If you remember learning about enzymes maybe and how they have this active site and they speed up reactions, I don't know if you remember ever learning about that, but what gives them their specific shape are these sulfhydryl groups. And the last one is called a carboxyl group or a carboxylic acid group. This is actually the other part of an amino acid. If I redraw for you, and that's the last one, by the way, and then you can take a snapshot. If I redraw for you a typical amino acid, it's going to have a group here, a group here. Here's your carboxyl or carboxylic acid group on this side, and here's your amino group on this side. So why is it called an amino acid? Because all amino acids have an amino group and a carboxylic acid group, and so it's called an amino acid. Every amino acid looks just like that. Yes?
Will the carboxylic acid group always have an OH?
Yes, that's the thing that makes it different from an aldehyde. Because an aldehyde is just a C double bond and an O and then just an H here. This one's always COOH. In fact, if they don't have, unfortunately I know in like flashcardlet you can't put drawings, which would be nice because these are all drawn out structurally. But sometimes you can see it written just like this, just as COOH. That's another way it's written. Because then that way it's not showing you the structure, it's just showing you what elements are in it.
And then a ketone, the carbon will attach to anything, right?
Correct. This would be somewhere, so you have like some kind of a chain, and then this, and then some other stuff. And here it's going to be on the end. You'll have a bunch of stuff, but then on the very end you'll have this sticking there. Yes?
So you think we should get flashcards and draw like that drawing?
I mean, that would be my
That's like
recommendation,
yeah.
because you definitely need to know, you will need to know these, every single one of these, because there's more like 15 or more functional groups, probably. But these are the specific ones that you need to know as far as the organic stuff we're going to talk about. You'll never have to know a lot of the other groups, so I didn't go through them. So that's where we're stopping. You have almost 30 minutes to work on the pre-lab. The biochemistry lab, you'll see it under labs. There's a whole pre-lab reading. Most of the answers to the pre-lab questions you can find right there in that reading at the top. And then when you scroll down, you'll scroll down, you'll see the procedures. Keep scrolling down, you'll see the pre-lab questions. So you can work on that today. That's what's due Friday. You can answer most of them just from the reading. A couple of them you may have to look up. But by tomorrow we will have covered everything that's there, just so you know. Let me stop this.